Hey, it's Tim back for Wrong Sports, and I'm going to be on the winning train for this one as I continue covering more great college football teams throughout history. This time I'll get to the 1920s, and I know you're probably thinking about some great teams then, and I'll tell you right now, I probably won't be covering all of those great teams. An example being the 1924 Notre Dame team. Instead, I'll be covering some great teams and players that didn't get enough recognition in their time, but hopefully they will get some right now. And like most lists that I've done, I'm going to be putting these in chronological order as it's really hard to rank teams. I will be referencing polls and All-American lists, so just a heads up on that. Also, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also, make sure you leave me a comment, please. I'm looking for comments. Tell me what you like about the video, what you don't like, what you want me to be covering. And of course, follow me on Twitter at SportsWronged. But let's get to the list. And I'm going to start out the list with a team that you got to really do a deep dive on to find, because now they're in the Southern Conference in the FCS, but in the 1920s they played in another Southern Conference, the Southern Atlantic Intercollegiate Athletic Association, which I'm not going to be ever saying again, so just a heads up, which were teams in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. And VMI went through pretty much new coaches every season in the 1910s, and then in the 1920s they hired a coach for a long time in Blandy Clarkson. He played for VMI a few years earlier, and Blandy would start his tenure at the school with a great team in 1920, and also he had a great player that year in Jimmy Leach. Leach was a great all-around player as he could kick, pass, crash through the line, or just about, crash through all of them. Even though he had great talent, VMI wasn't a big school and many didn't know about them, even outside the South, but this year they managed to sign a big-name opponent in Penn. They would start the season against four Virginia teams such as Virginia, Roanoke, and the Citadel, and in these four games they scored 247 points, including a 135-0 thrashing of Hampton-Sydney. They were 4-0, and they traveled to Philly to play the undefeated Penn team coached by the legendary John Heisman in his first year after he left Georgia Tech. Penn was ready for VMI early, but the Cadets eventually ran them down, including a 50-yard and 85-yard touchdown run by Leach, and VMI would come out of it with a shocking 27-7 win, which was the first time a Southern team or a non-Eastern school beat them. And VMI didn't stop after that as they played UNC and NC State in back-to-back weeks, with VMI shutting them both out, and then they closed out their season with another shutout and then a 24-7 win over Virginia Tech, giving VMI a 4-0 record versus Virginia teams and a 9-0 record overall. In the 9 games, VMI had 6 shutouts and they scored 48 points per game, and along with that, their top player, Jimmy Leach, had the NCAA record this season for total yards with 1,700 yards. Also, Leach connected on a few passes as well, including a 48-yard one, and he scored 26 touchdowns or 210 points that season. VMI continued to be good with a record of 9-1 in 1923 before moving to the Southern Conference in 1924, where they still reside to this day. And next up, I'm staying in the South, and if you can name where this team is located, then good for you, because most, if not all, people in the 1920s had not heard of this team. This is the 1921 Center College Praying Colonels, and they were a great team out of Kentucky, and not well known outside the South, even though they were undefeated in 1917 through 1919, and they only lost 2 games in 1920, so this team was awesome. Also, they had a great coach in Charlie Moran, who also coached at Texas A&M before this, but he was looking to make another great team in the South. And when Moran got on campus, he didn't have to look far to find his star, as he had Bo McMillan. McMillan was a track star on campus as well, and he played on the center team in 1917 before going to war in 1918 and then returning the next year. In 1919, Bo led the Center College to a 9-0 record versus mostly Southern teams, but they did beat Indiana and West Virginia, and he was named to Walter Camp's All-American team this year. In 1920, Bo was named to Camp's list again, but this time it was on the second team instead of the first team, and that might be because Center lost to defending national champions Harvard after being tied with them late into the game, but a costly turnover opened the floodgates for Harvard, and they eventually beat them 31-14. Center ended the 1920 season looking to make 1921 better, and they returned Bo McMillan for his final season, as well as introduced the college football world to their fullback and end and all-around blocker, Red Roberts. Roberts would be a first-team pick by Walter Camp in 1921, which was a rarity at the time, and he would be significant for this season as well because most of the South was very keen on stopping McMillan, but they would leave Roberts open to score, and he usually helped them win. And center would start doing just that as they went 4-0, beating some teams like Clemson and Tulane by 2 touchdowns or more, and they only gave up 6 points total in those 4 games. In their 5th game, though, they would get ready for their big one as they traveled to Boston with their rematch against Harvard, who were now riding a 25-game unbeaten streak. And this game was just like the 1920 game, but this time center had the formula to finally win, as McMillan took the ball early in the 3rd quarter and Roberts helped block McMillan for a 32-yard touchdown run and leaving 3 Harvard defenders in the dust while doing so, giving center their only points of the game. Good thing, though, that Harvard couldn't tie it up the rest of the game, and center came out with their biggest upset, 6-0, and it was one of the biggest upsets in college football history up to this day. The reason for that being, they were a small school in the South. They were one of the smallest schools overall. They had under 400 people on campus, and they beat one of the biggest schools in America at the time. Harvard coach Bob Fisher also gave all the credit to McMillan as he called him the best player in the country, and center would have to return home to play Kentucky the next week. They shut them out 55-0. And then they continued to shut out teams all throughout the South, including Auburn and Tulane. They were 9-0 when the season ended, and they were invited to not 1 but 2 bowl games, which is something that a team cannot do now. First, they would travel to San Diego the day after Christmas to play the 7-1 Arizona Wildcats, and center wiped the floor with them, beating them 38-0. And now they were 10-0, and they had 6 days to get to Dallas to play Moran's old team in the Texas A&M Aggies. And this game was also significant for A&M, as this was where their 12th man story came out of, and I won't go over that, that's for another time. And this would be another great team Center College would face because A&M was Southwest Conference champions at 5-1-2, but A&M were on a 6-week break. The game was fought hard as it was only 2-0 A&M leading at half, but Center would score early in the 3rd, making it 7-2, before A&M would take over here with a touchdown, then a fumble leading to another touchdown, and an interception leading to another touchdown, so it was now 22-7, and McMillan, who was stopped most of the game, managed to throw a touchdown pass, cutting the lead to 22-14. But they ran out of time and ended their season 10-1. Even with the loss, they beat previous national champions Harvard, and were the only school to beat Harvard not located in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, or Massachusetts. Center only gave up 6 points all season if you exclude the Dixie Classic, and they scored 28 points per game. Center would never reach the heights of this season or their run from 1919 through 21, and they are currently a Division III team in the Southern Athletic Association, but they have the 12th most wins in D3 football. Up next is a team that is currently in the Ivy League and actually one of the more underrated teams in the Ivy League. This is Dartmouth. I say this because they started playing in 1881, but they never got enough credit because they never went undefeated or untied from 1881 until 1923. However, this all changed for Dartmouth because they were in the middle of a great 3-year run under their coach Jesse Hawley, as from 1923 to 25, they went 23-1-1. Their only loss was in his first year in 1923. They went unbeaten with 1 tie in 1924, but I'm picking this 1925 season as their best team because they actually closed the deal and went unbeaten and untied this year. Another reason was because they had 3 All-Americans and they had a star quarterback in Andy Oberlander. He was a big reason for their offensive output too, but I'll get more to that in just a second. They were coming off of a 7-0-1 record, scoring 28 points per game, and Oberlander scoring 60 points with 10 passing touchdowns in that season. But coming into this season, they returned Oberlander and would unleash end George Tully, as Tully would become an All-American this season and play in some of the first NFL games in the next few years. Oberlander, though, would have some awesome games and some insane games in 1925, including having a 477-yard output and 6 touchdowns in a 62-13 thrashing of Cornell, who were coming into the game unbeaten this season. Oberlander and Dartmouth also beat Harvard for the 3rd time in a row this season, and it was the worst defeat of the 3 as they beat Harvard 32-9. Dartmouth would eventually close their season with a 33-7 defeat of Chicago, who won the Big Ten Conference the previous year, and Oberlander showed out in this game as he had 3 touchdowns. He would end the season too having 14 touchdown passes and 12 rushing touchdowns, which was one of the first players to have double-digit passing and rushing touchdowns in a season. This season, Dartmouth scored an average of 42 points per game too. They only had one game where they scored less than 33 points, plus they only gave up about 4.5 points per game, and they shut out 5 teams. So yeah, this team's awesome. Dartmouth wouldn't have an undefeated record again until 1962, so all credit again goes to this 1925 team. Okay, up next is another team that I'm pretty sure you don't know about unless you live in Kansas, but this team has a record that stood for over 50 years. This is the 1926 Haskell Indians. They are now known as the Haskell Indian Nation University, which is located in Haskell, Kansas, and they now play in the NAIA, but back before World War II, they played some big-time college football, and for one season they were the talk of college football. It was mostly due to one player though on their team, in Mays McLean, who is a power runner that also scored touchdowns, as he has a record that stood from 1926 until 1988, as he scored 38 rushing touchdowns. It was eventually broken by Barry Sanders. McLean was a big reason for their success, but also because they had a great offensive line which allowed their running game to run all over opponents, and that's exactly what they did. They started their season with a 65-0 shutout, and McLean scored 3 touchdowns, and he also kicked extra points, which, you might want to remember because it comes in handy next week, as McLean set a record that would stand for a while as he scored 8 touchdowns and kicked 7 extra points in a 57-0 win over Wichita, meaning McLean scored every single point except for 2 when they went for 2 points. Haskell continued their winning ways, shutting out their next opponent, and McLean scoring 10 total touchdowns in these 2 games. After 4 games, McLean was responsible for 139 points. In Game 5, Haskell needed everything they could get from McLean as he scored 27 points, and he on his own beat Dayton 30-17. Haskell continued to outclass any and all Midwestern teams, and after 8 games, they stood tall 8-0, with McLean scoring 31 touchdowns and being responsible for 211 points. McLean would get injured in their 8th game. He sat out games 9 and 10 with those injuries, which was against big-time teams Boston College and Michigan State. Haskell, though, kept running the ball, but they couldn't pull out a win against BC, tying them 21-21. But they easily beat Michigan State the next week to put them at 9-0-1 for when McLean would come back. And McLean continued right where he left off for their final 3 games, as he would outscore those 3 teams 42-14 all on his own. Haskell wasn't invited to a bowl game though, but they were in San Francisco before Christmas to play a team from Hawaii, and stuck around to play the second team from Stanford, who they would beat 4-1. So even though they didn't get to play a big-time bowl game, they got the experience of traveling out west and playing in California. Haskell ended their season 12-0-1. They had the most wins in the Midwest, and they also averaged 400 yards of rushing per game, which was a first for a team in this time. Plus McLean setting the touchdown record and also scoring 253 points, or an average of 23 points per game, which was a feat that wasn't matched until 1988 again by Barry Sanders. McLean would later transfer to the University of Iowa and play there in 1929 and make them better as they increased their wins from the previous year. One final trivia note on them: Haskell opened a stadium this year too, which the school and other local high schools still play in to this day. And finally, I'm staying in the Midwest, except I'm going to be going to Michigan, to Detroit, because Detroit was a city that was booming in the 1910s and 20s, and so were their sports teams, as the Tigers would win a World Series or 2, the Red Wings were winning, and the best football team playing in the city wasn't the Detroit Lions, it was the University of Detroit and the Detroit Titans football team, especially the 1928 version. The Titans were booming through the 1920s due to them hiring Gus DeReyes and getting better talent coming to the school. First, about DeReyes, he was a former Notre Dame quarterback who I mentioned in a previous list, who played some of the early professional football games opposite Jim Thorpe. Then he went into coaching, going out west to Gonzaga before going to Detroit. And DeReyes started slow with an 8-10-1 record in his first 2 years before he would score his best player in Lloyd Brazil. Brazil would start in 1927 and was a quarterback as well as a great runner. He led the team to a 7-2 record, including a close 6-0 loss to Army. That season, he was teamed up with Tom Connell, who was a captain on the team and the halfback of the team. Coming into the 1928 season, though, DeReyes had his team with Brazil and Connell, and they were going to do something better this season: pass the ball. Well, if you remember in my previous list of best oldest college football teams, I mentioned DeReyes was a quarterback on one of the early best Notre Dame teams that passed the ball, and he tasked Brazil with doing that same thing. And Brazil started their season with a shutout win over DePaul before having to travel to Tulsa to play Tulsa in close to 100-degree heat. And Tulsa was pretty good at the time, but Brazil would lead them over Tulsa 19-14 to give Tulsa one of their only 2 losses of the season. The Titans would come home for 4 of their next 5 games, and Detroit would win them all by an average of 31-0. Brazil stepped up in a game versus Michigan State as he scored 2 touchdowns, and Tom Connell saved the day and their season on their only away game during this 5-game stretch as they traveled to Dayton, where he scored the only touchdown in a 7-0 win. Detroit, now 7-0, traveled to New York City to the Polo Grounds to play Fordham, and Connell was the star as he scored all 19 points as he got the 3 touchdowns and kicked the only extra point in the game too. Detroit came home for their season finale versus the 8-1 Georgetown Hoyas, and Brazil and Connell would lead the team to a 33-13 win and a 9-0 undefeated record. The team would score 267 points, with Connell being responsible for 126 of them, and Brazil almost throwing for 1,000 yards as he threw for 997 yards, which was a height that season all throughout the nation. They had 7 shutouts this season too out of 9 games, another reason for their dominance all throughout the Midwest. And after 1928, Connell would graduate, but Brazil stayed for the 1929 season, and he led the NCAA major colleges with 1,117 rushing yards, and he also led in total offense as the team went 7-1-1 that season, making this 3-year run with Brazil at quarterback 23-3-1, and DeReyes' best stretch while he was at Detroit. And DeReyes would stay in Detroit until 1947 as he coached professionally for the Detroit Lions from 1943 to 1947, but he didn't have the same success he would have with the college team. Well, there you have it. There are the best unknown or maybe not talked about college football teams of the 1920s. I will have a list of the best unknown college football teams or not talked about college football teams from the 1930s coming up next. But as always, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you leave me a comment about any team that you think I'm forgetting, or maybe what other lists I should be doing or other teams I should be covering. And as always, make sure you follow me on Twitter at SportsWronged. And as always, make sure you have a great day, and make sure you check out the playlist to the side and all the other videos I have on my channel.